Cyberwar in the Age of the Cloud.
I'm Jeff Rich. I'm the Vice President of Member Success for the Cloud Security Alliance. And I want to thank all of you for being here. And I want to thank all of our panelists. You'll meet all of them in about 10 seconds, or each of them in about 10 seconds. A great group we have here. I'm not going to read their bios to you. They're online. They are, when you look at the background and you add all the experience that's here, we are ready for cyber war.
You know, one of the things when we think about what cyber warfare is, I think we all come at it from a very different place. I think some people understand it, some people don't. And I will say I had the pleasure of working in the federal government doing what we call our COOP and COG work. So continuity of operations and planning and continuity of government. That was across departments of commerce, state, and transportation. And the reason that's important is that was very impactful for me in understanding what wargaming looked like when we talk about having a very bad day for national security in the United States. Now, I was in the government pre-9/11 and post-9/11 began working certainly on homeland security issues. But as I looked ahead for what the next major risk was, because at that point I was really focused on helping owners and operators of critical infrastructure deal with risk, cybersecurity to me was that next big thing. Now, that was in 2005. I was in a law firm, as just said. When you said cyber in a law firm, the lawyers would say, is that privacy? Is that data security? And my point was no. We were talking about national security risk that could actually include injuries and fatalities. And the goal was to help the private sector understand how to work with the federal government to manage that risk. Fast forward now, we've certainly seen, even pre the war in Ukraine, where Russia was very clear about demonstrating publicly that the fact they had certain capabilities. So when they were able to be spoofing GPS and satellite in the Black Sea, everyone needed to pay attention, right? When they've shown that they have that kinetic ability to take out satellites and GPS, we've seen that. You know, we didn't really need, nor did we want, the exercise that we have had thus far with Russia and Ukraine. But what it has shown us is that there are massive capabilities for wiper malware to completely take out satellites and GPS. And so if you think that they have that ability, think what they can do to every other critical infrastructure sector. Right? Cloud would be a cakewalk, and we'll talk more about this. When we talk about what is cyber warfare, I'm just going to talk about two other points, and then I know we'll get into this. NATO, many years ago, looked at what needed to happen when it came to what mutual aid is under what we call Article 5. And when they added cyber warfare into that agreement, it really made clear from a international perspective what a whole of nations response needed to be. We have something called the Talon Manual, which you can, if you have insomnia, you can read 300 pages, but it defines what rules of engagement would be in cyber warfare. First one was in 2013, second one was in 2017. I think fast forward, what we need to focus on is what are those shared responsibilities between the private sector and the federal government. I do believe, as we've seen these lessons about what Russia can do, the big issue, they said just last week in the UN, that any commercial provider who is supporting the defense industrial base, like satellites, is fair game in war. And so that means we need to think about what can the federal government help the private sector do and how we're going to manage risk in a different way. I'll stop there.
Norma, thanks very much. Bob.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I'm new to CISA, so I'm not going to talk a lot about the deep intricacies of cyber warfare, but a lot of what I'm doing at CISA is actually directly related and butts up right against the kinds of conversations that we're having here. One of the things that I want to make sure everybody knows, so I don't forget, is that we have this pretty good website called Shields Up. Has anybody gone to that website, Shields Up? Okay, a whole people doing this. Like, yes, I went there a little bit a while ago, but maybe not for a while. It's actually pretty good. And there are a number of other resources that are available throughout the CISA website, ranging from toolkits for starting your cybersecurity program to things you can do as a small business owner. I mean, really, there's just a tremendous set of resources available. And I remember back, I think it was in 2013 or so, when I was at Twitter, and we had an intrusion. And I remember when that happened, that there had been this DHS bulletin that had gone out, and it wasn't really clear what they were talking about, and it didn't have a sense of urgency. And I look back and I said, well, they kind of sort of said what we needed to do, but who are these folks and what is their credibility, and is this a clear and present danger? Because what they were asking us to do would have been very disruptive to the organization. And it turns out we should have done that, and people in the government knew that we should have, and many other organizations should have done this thing. And that's just a very different space than we're in today. And, I don't know if you follow Director Easterly on Twitter or Rob Joyce from the NSA, but they tweet a remarkably high-quality, curated list of things for you to worry about. Rob Joyce today tweeted out a thing about a VMware clever vulnerability. It's not quite a vulnerability. It's an attack pattern that people should be aware of. So it's not a 0 day. It's understanding how the attackers are taking advantage of intentional features. This just hadn't happened 10 years ago, at least in my experience, and working at tech companies. And we not only have those kinds of resources available, there are the 10 different regions in CISA. So we have regional offices that can be much more responsive to local concerns, local problems. So you're not always dealing with the folks like me at headquarters. You get to deal with somebody who's far more in touch with your kinds of, your industries and your problems. There are endless webinars. This morning I got an Eventbrite that said, hey, wouldn't you like to attend the CISA seminar? I wish I had this 10 years ago. These are just remarkable resources. So as we think about getting prepared, as we think about the kinds of bad things that can happen, they may be due to criminal syndicates, griefers, joyriders, or nation states conducting something akin to cyber war, whatever that really means. I'll let you decide that. I think there are resources that we may not be really taking full advantage of because we haven't had to do that before. And so one of the questions when I talk to people I ask is your organization taking advantage of these left of boom and right of boom resources that CISA has and other agencies? And the answer is often, I don't really know. I don't know what the full catalog looks like. I need to go look at that. So not only do I think you need to look at that, I think the senior leadership needs to look at that. Because right of boom, you may be asked by skeptical, unhelpful, unfriendly people, why didn't you take advantage of these resources? And if you don't, and there's a business reason, that's fine. It's a decision made at the appropriate level in the organization. If you say, wow, I saw some tweets and I didn't really engage and I didn't sign up for the webinars and I just didn't do that. That's not a helpful response, especially under deposition. So I think communication and reaching out it's a shared responsibility. We talked about that earlier. And so I think a lot of what's happening is we're reaching out, but we need other folks to be part of that conversation.
Thank you. So we're all warriors in the same fight. So you've heard two lifestyle support here. One, if you have trouble sleeping, you had a suggestion. The other, if you have trouble staying awake, you heard a suggestion. And now we're with Kathleen.
Some of the stuff is actually quite readable.
They're both, actually.
Some of the stuff I wrote.
Thank you for having me here today. And so I'm at the Center for Internet Security. We do work with CISA, but CIS supports the underserved and specifically state, local, tribal, and territorial organizations. So if they're hit by an attack, they call us, right? They call the Multi-State Information Sharing Analysis Center, and that's a place where they can go to for help. Now, I also mentioned they're under-resourced. And so some of them don't have the option to have somebody join one of these calls because they can't hire somebody. They're lucky to get a high school student. And this is something I heard from a county level CISO. The local entities just can't hire anyone. And so one of the big drivers for me in the work that I do is working with each of you to how can we better build in security? How can we improve it? And what that will do for us is really force the attackers to become more targeted, right? So those broad-based attacks are not as feasible. If you looked at what happened to Okta, one of their partners was compromised, but they caught it within 25 minutes. That's remarkable. So as we move to these more secure, hardened infrastructures with, I have a lot of hope for the next 2 to 5 years where we move to more automation provided from the vendor, more shift left, where we have built-in controls managed at scale by the provider. and I'd love to talk to more of you about that who are interested, because we have to think for cyberwar and planning that we focus the attackers. Now, one of the other things I do is I teach at Georgetown. And I get to teach a course on cyber threat intelligence and work through students and their knowledge on cultural norms and identity for threat actors. And when we think about things like the kill chain, we end on action on objectives. So most people stop thinking about, okay, I've been compromised, I have to remediate my systems, I have to start all over. And that was the end of the attack once you eradicate the attackers. But if you take a look at something like SolarWinds, there was a huge number of entities attacked, right? So broad-based, then they were selective. Who did they go after, right? And what happened for each of those entities? And for some of them, data was exfiltrated. Now, what we know is that this was from Russia. And to me, that means the attack's not over, right? What's going to happen with that data? There will be discord as a result of use of that data at some chosen point in time. And Russia's more patient than the United States, so it could be a few years down the road. China's even more patient, right? So you have to think about the cultural norms of your threat actor, and cultural norms change, right? They're not constant. But there are patterns over time that transfer from post-Cold War kinetic to current-day cyber in terms of those cultural norms. Like Iran, for instance, they go after revenge fairly consistently. If there's a sanction put on them, it might not be revenge directly against the nation. It could be against some sector, like the financial sector. And we saw those VPN attacks in 2020 that were using a day one exploit. So the vulnerability was known and published. And so that really fell into their pattern of reuse. So we have these identity and cultural norms that we have to consider, because that leads us to think more about the actual risk. Is it economic gain? Is it sowing discord?
And let's talk about that risk if we can, because I think, everyone feeling better yet? There's a lot to digest there. And since I'm the moderator, I'm going to put out a definition of cyber war, which I have seen, and I won't give attribution, I put a couple together, but briefly, cyber war, for the definition of today's discussion, for the purpose of today's discussion, involves the target being a nation state. Now, that's also not easy to define, because sometimes you can hit one critical infrastructure and it may be perceived as a private enterprise and not part of a nation state. But since there are, in the US anyway, 16 defined critical infrastructures, it could very well be either a prelude or the first step of an attack on a nation state. So if we go with that, knowing a nation state has to be involved, the first question I have for each, I'm going to ask if we can do it briefly, because I'm guessing we have some questions in the audience. And I'm going to start with Bob this time, if you could. Number one, if elevator pitch of what's your biggest concern with cyber war?
Well, I think a few things. One is I'm very concerned about the interrelationship between all of the different parts of our industry. So the small and medium-sized businesses kind of roll up into the larger organizations. So we're deeply interconnected. And that means that we need to start building these products that are really going to be safe by design. So the thing that you'll hear me coming back to over and over again, and I'm sure I'll get some echoes over here,
yes,
and amplifications, is we haven't come to a world in which we can expect the products that we use to be safe by design and safe by default. And what we've done is we have tacitly put the burden of security and safety on those organizations that are least capable of dealing with that. So that's that's the thing that
That's a pretty good concern. I'll accept that one. Thanks.
You can push back if you want.
No, I'll accept. No, pushback's coming, trust me.
I mean, that just defined what I do day to day, right? Bob and I are very much aligned on that theme of how can we push this envelope to get security better by default, but also I guess what I'd add to that is just managed over time. I think we can purchase some systems out of the box secure, but then misconfigurations and drifts are causing 80% of the attacks on some service providers, and that's a number I got from one last week. So that is the big concern.
Okay, great. It's good to hear you. And any?
The question was, what do I worry the most about
what's
cyber
your biggest
warfare?
concern with cyber war?
My biggest concern is that we have a massive, catastrophic cybersecurity attack that involves injuries and fatalities, right? If you think about the worst case scenario, which is really what when I was in the government and when the government is doing now, is you have to think about the worst case scenario and work your way back. And in working your way back and demonstrating to critical infrastructure and owners and operators that the risk is real. This is not like a TV show. This is not a pie in the sky. We're not even talking about Sony anymore. We're talking about destructive attacks that I think it then honestly helps people focus, at least if you are the owner and operator of these industries, what that means. And then I think you then can easily then get back to really the premise, because the premise is you do need security by design. But I'll say this, there are many sectors that are spending millions and billions of dollars on cybersecurity, and they understand the risk. But we do have key sectors that are not fully embracing how to manage it, and we have state and local governments that desperately need help as well.
And territories, yes.
And territories, yes, that's right.
Absolutely. So the common theme I'm hearing once again is every owner-operator is part of cyber war now. At least at least in a defensive position, and depending on some situations, maybe offensive. So I'm going to start with, I don't know where you are, Dominic. Do we have any questions yet? Okay. Well, why don't we hear the first one, please?
We talk about security in terms of layers and depth. Where in the infrastructure do you believe we are most likely to see an attack, and how do we recognize it?
So
and it's two layered. So you want the second part now?
There's a follow-up question. Okay.
If you could deploy one thing for identification and protection, what would it be?
I'm going to ask, let's put off the second part because it indicates what the first answer might be, and I'd rather have you hear from me what the first answer might be. So, Kathleen, you look like you're ready to explode with an answer.
No, actually, can you repeat the question? Because then I started focusing on the second question.
So could we hear the first again, please?
We talk about security in terms of layers and depth. Where in the infrastructure do you believe we are most likely to see an attack, and how do we recognize it?
Right. Anywhere where there's a weak spot. And this goes back to my example before with, the broad-based attacks that we're seeing, Kaseya, SolarWinds, hitting as many and then focusing down on what was likely the real targets. So wherever there's a weak spot, the Okta attack, it was a partner that they were able to infiltrate first. Supply chain, right? So supply chain, cloud providers, wherever there's a weakness is where the attackers will go after. And if we have things more focused, so weaponizing, we're going to force them to be more targeted in their attack. So there'll be less collateral damage, right? We won't have as many organizations like SolarWinds having to do cleanup. It would just be the one targeted, unfortunately.
And that's a wonderful example of multi-layered, I think. Any other thoughts, Bob?
Yeah, I think we've had some free pen testing over the last year or so. So we've seen a number of well-funded companies with great, truly outstanding world-class security teams be compromised, and through a variety of different mechanisms. The one that I think is really alarming is of course, the ransomware, which we talk about a lot. But the joyriding is one that I don't think we've fully digested. So this idea that a 17-year-old can simply make a few phone calls and get access to companies' entire infrastructure, those are near misses for the organizations who weren't directly impacted. Where we are not really taking a stock of those near misses, we find a way to distance ourselves. We say, I'm not in that business, or that's a tech company, or we find ways to not actually. I
would never be a target. Say that again? I would never be a target.
Right.
Yeah, and when we're very good at this as humans, at finding ways to ignoring these near misses. And sometimes these are weak signals, and I understand why we don't always pick up on weak signals. Some of these signals are incredibly strong, and they should be conversations at the board, and they should be causing truly dramatic changes within the organizations, and we're not seeing that. I mean, at the start of the pandemic, there were organizations that had to do little to nothing to accommodate everyone working from home 100% and still be at whatever level of security they found appropriate. Other organizations had to go out and buy products and change things. those organizations had latent risk that they had not understood and managed. And so we're seeing these patterns and waves happening. And, long before we get to worrying about the cyber warriors, we should be worried about all of these other threat actors and threat vectors that we're not quite dealing with today. Right. I mean, if you hang out with me for more than 30 seconds, I'll say only 22% of folks who are in the enterprise space are using MFA, and only 30% of administrators. This is bonkers.
So you're answering the second question too, which is good, a bonus.
Yeah. There's no, it's hard to see the person, but there's no one, there you go. There's no one answer to that question, right? That's the hard part. If we could say 100% of your risk is your supply chain, then you know what to do. I think the challenge is we have different cultures amongst our critical infrastructure on their awareness of the risk and how complex their systems are. And honestly, the place where I think we have the greatest challenge are those who are the most heavily regulated for safety, because there's a false sense of security. I mean that literally, that if you are regulated for safety, like in the transportation industry or even in water, wastewater, where you have regulations for what you need to do, that covers cybersecurity, and it doesn't. So supply chain is a big issue for everyone, understanding your supply chain, physical and otherwise. But I think unfortunately there's no one easy answer.
So everything we're hearing that enterprises are supposed to do to protect themselves within the enterprise space sounds like, for the most part, are the same things we should be doing to protect ourselves in the cyberwar space. And so now, not only is the line fuzzy between kinetic war and cyberwar, it's becoming fuzzy between enterprise protection and nation-state protection.
Yep.
And the piece I would just add in between is, we have to be careful, as much as we have these extremes, understanding cyber physical risk is really important, right? Mm-hmm. So when we talk about industrial control systems and SCADA systems, that's a very different nexus when we talk about what enterprise risk is. And I think sometimes we don't spend as much time on that because we have too many sectors who have that challenge.
And those are different cultures too.
And they're very different cultures.
And I didn't really fully realize, I had heard that, but didn't fully digest that until I took an ICS class. And the instructor was talking about how he was an old school ICS guy and had been, his worldview had changed, and now he understands the way that the people who are doing regular IT infrastructure security have been thinking about the threats. He's now adopted those. So that for me was very concerning to hear that, yes, that there were, although the attacker sees opportunities, sees the soft spots, that there were defenders who were not fully embracing the clear and present danger. And so that's something else we have to do, is reach out and make sure that we're all talking, which
same thing,
hasn't always been the case.
Yeah. And I think we touched on the identification portion of the second question, which I heard MFA. There's more to that. Do we want to go to passwordless? If I'm going to avoid the sexy technology around this right now, only because I think I'd rather let's bring it up just a level to the cyberwar level, if we can. And do we have? I think I saw a hand go up, and there's one down here, Dominic. If you're in the back, I apologize. I can't see you because of the light. But
I'm halfway. We're good.
So we've been talking about defense, and I wanted to bring up offense, Title 10, Title 50 authority. And my the kind of West Point War 101 definition of cyber war is a nation imposing your will on the enemy after failure of diplomacy. Stuxnet was a good example of that. In defense, we have been, and as a government, have been supporting the commercial sector has more resources and money in some defense at the highest level. What about on offense? Again, going back to Title 10 authority that they don't have, but there has been use of international proxy actors to do attacks against and retaliation by public companies. And I just wanted to kind of see what the feeling was of the panel on that. Because from a deterrence standpoint, just like the guy on YouTube who goes after all the call centers and takes them out, the spam call centers, like, it's a good deterrent if you're going to get taken out if you hit the wrong person.
So you must have been reading my next question, because it dealt with proportional response, which is often the term that's used with what you're talking about. What is, in kinetic war, proportional response is easy to measure. It's not quite as easy in cyber war. So to your point, and I'm guessing there's at least one person in this panel that doesn't want to answer this question, but who wants to first?
I mean,
Okay.
I'm happy to start. One of the things that's been really important is having clarity on how extensive those authorities are or aren't. Sorry, I have to do this so I can see you. I think what we need to do now is have a modification or sort of a potential expansion of this. The United States has made a clear decision sometimes that a show of force, i.e. deterrence, is needed. I am confident that the United States government, which I have no information about, is utilizing its offensive capabilities where it is necessary. The difference I think that we have to think through right now is both proportionality, right? At what point are we going to go head to head? And that really does go with the definition of what cyber warfare is. But if our private sector is going to be the proxy, which we're starting to see, then I think we need a better conversation between the intelligence community and those who have tools that can actually give information, whether it's on the cyber threat intel side or other tools, I'll just leave it at that, to better help them protect themselves. And that there is a huge gap there. Banking financial services sector, for instance, has been asking for increased intel sharing for 100,000 years. But those, we need to think through those authorities.
Good. And Kathleen, I think you...
Sure. So I also don't have any insight. I have no clearance at the moment. And so this gives me an ability to speak a little more freely just in terms of my thoughts on this. If anyone's read any of... there's several authors who make this point. Bob Buchanan, I believe, is one of them, that every single country is inside of every single country in terms of cyber. And they have triggers like Cold War levers that they can pull. And in terms of the U.S. position, they did publish something maybe 3 or 4 years ago about an attack that was conducted 5 years prior in NPR. It's a great article. But they put their offensive positioning as defend forward. Right, and so that catchphrase was put out there. And the example, so we do know Stuxnet, but there's no real attribution there. This particular attack was to take down ISIS, and it was so coordinated and swift. And now it's probably 8 years ago, but they're purposeful in not publishing it from the United States. Right, their capabilities are good. They're quiet. They're swift. There's different characteristics for other nations in terms of how they do their offensive operations. And so those are some of the distinctions. Okay, thanks. Anything to say?
I'm good.
Okay, good. I had a feeling that might be your answer. Thank you. Yeah, and I knew there would be, and thank you, Jim. So Dominic, what's the next one in the app, please?
Yes, of course. How would you assess the threat of a cyber attack within the next 3 to 5 years? What's the likelihood and impact?
Okay, once again, maybe there's going to be at least 2 people that can answer this. Kathleen, you want to start, please?
I would just say, what's the likelihood of one attack? How about 100,000 attacks every 5 minutes? I mean, I think the question, I'm not trying to be flip, actually. The question is, what level of attack are we really asking about?
I asked this question, the reason why, let me elaborate. So I'm a consultant. I'm working with defense industrial base customers on CMMC. I'm also working on critical infrastructure. And a lot of the conversations I have with these organizations is that they're responding to the regulations, but there's a substantial resistance. They're saying, okay, we're only doing it because the government is telling us to. And I can't tell them why they should do it for national security or for their own interests. So what I'm really looking is your interpretation for how likely it is, what's the real risk, so that I can communicate to these organizations about, their responsibility to their customers and to the country to take action.
Okay.
I'm going to give you two pieces of advice as to how to do that, and we'll see what everybody else thinks. I really can't see. One, look, CMMC and CUI, controlled unclassified information, is the lowest common denominator. If they are not understanding where you're going on that, then one, I'm sorry. Two,
and let's talk about that offline.
Yeah, 100%. Two, you know what? Give them another tool that is the bully pulpit, and that's the federal government has made clear in an executive order last year, 14028, if you'd like the number, that all government contractors will be required to meet specific cybersecurity requirements with a self-attestation, and at such point they'll lose all their contracts, right? So if you're getting a business push that, you know, they're only going to do it if they have to, just tell them they're going to lose all their government contracts.
Yeah, they don't think it's real.
Well,
I think they'll find out.
It is. Okay.
Yeah, so you are actually identifying a very interesting problem, which is how do we take a look at what organizations are doing today to secure themselves? And again, I think a lot about the SMBs, because I think those are often the forgotten part of our economy, although it's 99+% of American enterprises. And we say, we want you to do better. And when we say that we want them to do better, we're actually, in some ways, asking them to work against their own self-best interest. And it's very hard to argue to millions and millions, tens of millions of organizations that you should just be good citizens and turn on MFA. And you should just be good citizens and do whatever. This is not really going to be a strong strategy. You have to think about the other parts of the incentive. So purchasing power of the government is one of those angles to try to improve the security of organizations, but it can't be the only one. And so, you know, as Kathleen can talk about in more detail than I think I can, I thought I knew a lot about this stuff, and then I met her. I think we really do have to figure out how to manage the incentives so that the organizations who are building products want to build them so they're safe by design and safe by default. Those are two related but different things. And to create larger incentives for every organization to do better. I think right now, if we ask them to do better, it's hard for them to do that. And we go around saying, hey, this company should have used MFA, tisk. This company should have patched the one thing, tisk. But we don't stop to ask why those weren't turned on by default and why there are so many patches that have to be deployed. So I think the incentives the incentives we have today are going to lead to the situation that we see today. And we have this gap between what everyone is doing and what is best for the national security. And there's a lot more to unpack that, but this is actually a very interesting point. And I've started to think more about that. So I don't have the answer for you, but if we don't solve whatever these root causes are, the major contributing factors to the thing that you're describing downstream, if we don't fix that upstream, we're just going to keep seeing it.
So I agree with that. And I'll just ask one last question, is loop back to my original question. I won't ask you the difficult question, which is what would be the impact.
Oh, that was an easy one?
But what's the likelihood of a cyber war attack against the United States in the next 3 to 5 years?
100%.
Can I?
Sure.
That's a packed question, and I didn't get to respond on the other one, so I might mix it a little bit. I think it's pretty much 100%, right, is the chance of attack. How we handle the next 3 to 5 years makes a big difference. Norma mentioned the executive order for built-in security. I think that's a fantastic measure that's forcing vendors to start building in security. I would like to take that a step further. It can't just be built in. It has to be managed securely over time with architectural patterns at scale. We have placed the burden on end organizations to secure one product with 5 other products and then hire people to manage all those products and configure them, even though the configurations are fairly consistent across the board for many of these things, right? There is a lot we can do with newer technology that has come out. We've made big strides with things like the trusted platform module and the trusted execution environment, and we've proven out those capabilities with things like trusted boot processes. We have to pull that up the stack. And I am talking to lots of vendors who are starting to inch towards more automation that scales, meaning we're shifting left.
So
it's going to take that 3 to 5 years. So I think 2 years from now, we're going to see some really big improvements, and those attacks will have to be more targeted. They're always going to be there, right? There's always going to be a weak link. There's always going to be social engineering.
So these are the right defenses, if I could. But I'm going to do a quick poll, if I may. I heard 100%.
100%,
Okay.
right.
Bob, do you
The source
care
of the
to?
threat actor is interesting, but we're seeing similar kinds of attacks left and right. Again, we need to pay attention to these joyriders. This should be a huge wake-up call. We've had wake-up call after wake-up call after
So
wake-up
you're
call.
saying 100% in the next 3 to 5 minutes, not the next 3 to 5 years?
I'm saying that the attackers are doing what attackers do, and defenders need to step up.
So let me say this. I'm going to answer it a different way. I think we're going to see potentially increasingly destructive attacks in the next 3 to 5 years.
So are you at 100% as well?
100%.
Okay, so first of all, there's your answer.
Right. And for those attacks, I mean, I'm considering also sowing discord as being a result, right? If we're fighting each other because discord has been sown on positions like pineapple on pizza, it's a DHS example. You can Google search that. That is a successful attack, right? They're weakening us.
But I don't know that that question is going to get where you're looking to go. So if you take them and you say it's 100%, we know that there are these attacks that are happening nonstop, and we're still not finding the way to do this. We talked earlier about people finding a way to dismiss attacks, and they say, that's not going to be me. Oh, I'm a low-level supplier. I'm not going to be part of a nation-state attack. And people really believe this, or at least they believe it long enough to get back to whatever it was that they were doing before. So these are the kinds of incentive problems that we need to figure out how to define much more precisely than we have to date. And when we figure that out, we'll come back here and let you know.
And I'm going to come pretty close to doing a wrap here. And it's good to hear you're hearing different perspectives, but you're really hearing the same theme. I didn't hear the word. I don't think the word military came up once, and all we've been talking about is war. So, all of you look surprised at that, but yeah, we haven't talked about that yet. And I'm not suggesting we do. We do not have enough time, and I want to make sure you knew. Our objective here wasn't to necessarily answer the question about when's it going to happen and where's it going to be and how many deaths are going to be attributed to it. But I think you're hearing it's coming, it's here, and we all need to be ready at an individual level and at an enterprise level and at a community level and at a nation level. So in the final 4 minutes or so, I'd like to give each of you, a minute and a half or so to, do you want to have a final message for everyone here? I started earlier, I'm moving my way down, Kathleen. If you have what's your closing message to make them feel better about what we've been discussing the past 45 minutes?
Oh, that's different then.
Sure. So feeling better about it, I think we'll be in a different place in 3 to 5 years from where we are today. And that is because we are beginning to make headway on not just built-in security, but I'm going to push that extra step on managed securely over time. I think people are starting to grasp that. And the further progress we can make, the attackers will have to be more focused and targeted. But we will be in a better place in a few years because we will make progress on these fronts from the federal government efforts. CIS, we also help to aggregate a whole other market that's equivalent spend. So perhaps we can help motivate vendors, but I think we all have to motivate vendors. And then those of you at vendors, we need to start making a difference. So we're thinking about security at scale and not putting the burden on the end user. What can we do that serves them better?
Thank you very much. And Bob, your closing,
I'm
make them feel
going to
good?
geek out just for a brief second. So 2/3 of CVEs that you'll see flying through your networks, 2/3 of those are related to memory safety, which is our addiction to C and C++. This is absurd. No other industry would ever tolerate this level of defect rate, which is a design decision chosen by the product manufacturers. It is chosen over and over and over again. My nephew is in college taking computer science class. What language do you think that they're teaching him? C++. So this is an area where we simply have not chosen to look at the hardest, biggest problems. We've chosen to ignore them and rearrange deck chairs on the Titanic. That's the bad news. You wanted something uplifting.
That's
all right,
the feel
so I'll
better
give you
part.
something uplifting. There are lots of weak but growing signals that we're going to figure out a way to at least cap the damage. So there are other programming languages which are memory safe. The one that's kind of skyrocketing to the top is called Rust. And Rust is not only memory safe, but is kind of beloved by people who start to use it, which is kind of a weird thing for a variety of reasons I won't go into. But we're starting to see its uptake. We're seeing it being accepted as a proper first-class citizen within the Linux kernel space. So there's lots of activity, lots of awareness that's starting. But frankly, it's years too late, and it's going to take us a long time to get there. But if any of you have any opportunities to start helping push towards memory-safe languages, that's going to be a huge win for everybody.
I agree. And you had the last, let us make us feel great.
The last word, what an act of beauty. You know, on the upside, what I think for this topic, what we want people to understand in the audience and where you work and who you work with is that cyber warfare is a real thing. Right? You know, it's particularly in the age of the cloud, but we want people to understand that there is systemic risk. I think sometimes people hear that too much. But the point is that we all have a responsibility in this system. And so whether you are an owner and operator of critical infrastructure, you are selling a product, you are selling a service, if you understand where you sit in this ecosystem, then we want you inherently to understand that there's responsibility there, right? You have to be producing safe and secure systems, but you also have to be able to understand where you have gaps. And that is where the federal government, you know, can be of help. CISA has terrific resources, the FBI has resources, but we want people to actually do something about their risk. And once you identify that you have risk, then I must say you should do something about it. But we're trying to demystify that cyber is not someone else's problem. Do you need to know what your supply chain is? Is it complicated? Yes, there's a lot of issues there. But I think if you understand it, then you're on the path to managing the risk. And that's really the important
Thank
point.
you. So we haven't solved the problem, but we've given you all the answers you need so that you can all solve the problem.
Shields up.
And thank you very much, everyone. And please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you.